Infrastructure, whether it's roads, dams, or schools, is critically important to the state of California and the quality of life of Californians. We estimate that over the last decade, the state has spent about $100 billion building and replacing its infrastructure, and even more repairing infrastructure and leasing facilities. The state has funded about 2/3 of its infrastructure spending over this period of time using a type of borrowing called bonds. The state generally repays these bonds with interest over about a 25 to 30-year period, typically from the general fund, which is the state's main operating account. Currently, about 5%, just over 5% of the state's general fund dollars go to repaying the principal and interest on these infrastructure bonds. The other 1/3 of the state's infrastructure spending is paid for upfront using the pay-as-you-go approach, almost all from special funds, things like the gas tax. State spending on infrastructure is heavily focused in a few areas, most notably transportation and education. Over the past 10 years, the state has spent about half of its infrastructure dollars on transportation projects like roads, highways, and bridges. It's also spent about 1/3 of its infrastructure spending on educational facilities like K-12 schools, public colleges, and universities. Two other major areas of state spending on infrastructure are natural resources, like water projects or parks, and criminal justice, like courts, local jails, and prisons. As you may have noticed, some of these types of infrastructure are at the local level. Local parks, K-12 schools, local streets and roads, and local jails. In fact, more than half of the state's infrastructure dollars are spent by local agencies at the local level. Over time, the state's role in funding this local infrastructure has changed as state and local roles have evolved. Also, there are ongoing debates about what the state's role should be in funding local infrastructure. For instance, currently there are conversations about what the state's role should be in funding K-12 school facilities. It's important to note that locals also spend substantial amounts on local infrastructure. For example, locals fund most water infrastructure. They also fund about half of the transportation infrastructure and more than half of K-12 school construction. Looking forward, we expect that the state will face challenges providing infrastructure. This includes demands driven by increases in state population, as well as shifts in where the state's population resides. For instance, as school-age populations move to other parts of the state, this can drive demands for K-12 schools. Additionally, much of the state's infrastructure is aging. Currently, much of the state's infrastructure is over 40 years old, and there are significant maintenance needs. In fact, the administration estimates that there's a backlog of maintenance projects of over $60 billion in the state. The state will also face challenges funding this infrastructure. For example, in some areas like education, the existing bond authority that the state has is almost all committed to existing projects. In other areas, traditional funding sources have not kept pace with demands. For example, gas taxes haven't kept pace with demands on the transportation system. As folks drive more fuel-efficient vehicles and use less gas, they're generating less gas taxes to pay for this infrastructure. Given these challenges, policymakers will face difficult choices in trying to fund the state's transportation needs going forward.